And here I've got my jig, which is a couple of sockets held together with a nice squared wooden plug. So the plate goes on here first, and it goes on that way up with that rivet pointing upwards, and the 5 blades get put into position. Just make sure my tweezers are fairly clean, they feel good. And the blades just go in so that their rivets fall into those holes. Now I can see there's quite a curve on this blade here. It's got a bit of a bow on it. That'll be the result of the oils, I'd say. Get this blade, next blade in position. Swing those blades out so I've got access to that hole. That's it. Swing those blades back and lift this blade over the top of that rivet. Swing all the blades in like that. Now the moving plate goes on, and that goes with its little post upwards, and I know from experience it goes here. Seating that over all the rivets. You can see there's the peg on it pointing up at this point. There's their peg on our fixed plate. And then the case can go on over the top. This only goes on in one position. That peg on the over here comes up through a slot in the case at this point. So we'll line that up. Something's catching. Here it is. Give that a wriggle. Flip it over. I'm lifting the outside of my jig off now and putting it on underneath. I can see that one of my blades has moved slightly from the fixed plate, so I'll get one screw in here. Do that up very lightly indeed. I'll get another one in over here. That'll do. And one of my blades here, I can see that the pivot's not quite in. And rattle that back into place. Put the screw back in. Not wanting to fall back into position. That should just about be it. Just move the moving plate. Yeah, it's just dropped in. That's fine. Do up my 3 screws. There's the diaphragm. Moves nice and smoothly. I don't need to do anything more to that. If it had been a bit unduly stiff, that can often be, if you've got distorted blades, they're effectively sprung up and they're not wanting to run over each other smoothly. In those cases, I might put a little bit of graphite powder in here and work it backwards and forwards a number of times and then blow it away. Make sure there's no loose powder left, and that would make for a very smooth running diaphragm. But you only use graphite powder in a situation like that on a freshly cleaned diaphragm that's got absolutely no oil or grease on it. Otherwise you'd end up with clumps of graphite powder sticking on there in great lumps, causing you more problems than you started with. Right, so there's our shutter case. That's ready to go. And I can turn my attention to the mechanism plate. And the mechanism plate needs to be cleaned carefully. And as before, I'm using naphtha. And this top surface of the mechanism plate, there's often a good deal of grease on here, depending on how enthusiastic someone has been at applying graphite grease. Some repairers are in the habit of applying it like they're buttering a piece of toast, and they spread it everywhere. Of course, it doesn't do any good everywhere. It's like most lubricants, a little bit in the right place is the best policy. You can see the dirt coming off here, that's mostly oil and so forth coming off there. And it's not particularly grey, so it is mostly oil, it wasn't graphite grease. The graphite grease would show up as a sort of a charcoal grey colour, more like that. The yellowy colour is certainly just oil. So I want to get all of this clean. Got a bit of cotton there now, let's get rid of that. That's our detent spring, that's usually lubricated. It's worth going over this once or twice because you'll find that if there's any amount of oil on here, it tends to collect in little crevices. And you'll think you've got it clean, and then you look down and you can see a bright shiny spot around a crevice or a hole where the oil is now seeping its way back out to cause you trouble. This is the face that faces the shutter blades. This is the face that needs to be cleanest. That's good. I'll pop that to one side. The blade actuating ring. This needs to be lubricated. You could lubricate this with molybdenum paste. You could even lubricate it sparingly with graphite grease. I'm in the habit of lubricating with a bit of graphite powder. Graphite powder has the advantage that it's not going to get sticky over time. It's not going to gather up dust. I'll wipe that inside edge. You can see the oil coming off there. And these 5 posts coming up here swing the shutter blades. They move the shutter blades in and out. They're moving pivots, if you like. Well, that looks fine. A few little marks on there, nothing that would cause a problem. And here's the lens tube. This part's called the lens tube. And this is usually greasy because there's usually grease around the outside where the dial, where the setting rings go. So I just want this all clean. So I will choose what grease, what lubricants go where. and I don't want any others. This back face surface here, just cleaning that. There's a bit of corrosion on that. That won't cause us any problems. It's very slight. This is all brass anyway. There's a limit to how much corrosion it'll get, unless it had been subjected to water damage, and there's no reason to believe that. So, the mechanism plate. I'll put the blade actuating ring back in place. Got to make sure that spring is back behind its post there. That's better. Blade actuating ring goes in here, swinging in underneath that spring, drops it into place. Make sure it's not caught under anything or behind anything, and I can swing that detent spring into position. And it acts against that pin on the blade actuating ring. Now, taking that, I can take my lens tube and fit that in place. It only goes in one position. It goes in right there. I've got to make sure that I haven't got my palette stuck underneath it or any of the levers. Is it going to wriggle into position? Yeah, it just snapped in. There's 3 screws that hold that in place. They'll look much the same. One is slightly longer. It's important to note the slightly longer one, because the slightly longer one runs through this plate. And so it's longer by the thickness of the plate. And if you mix them up, you'll either end up with a screw that's sticking out the other side of the mechanism plate to catch on shutter blades, and you'll end up with a screw that's too short to do the job. So it'll be only have half as many threads in engagement with the aluminium plate as it should do, and so it's in great danger of getting stripped when you do the screw up tight. So take great care that you have the right screw in the right place, and that they're not sticking out through the plate. That's good. That's our blade actuating ring in place. It doesn't move freely. That lever's stuck under there. Yeah, that lever was sitting on top of that one, so yeah, it does, it moves freely. So I'll lubricate this through these areas with a bit of graphite powder and work that in. And at the top, where that detent is here, I'll lubricate that with a touch of molybdenum paste, where that spring runs over that pin. In between the two, that usually makes for a nice smooth action with a pronounced detent. So it tends to, this is the park position. It doesn't move from the park position easily. Once it does start moving, it moves freely. And it's quite positive when it returns to the park position. So, graphite powder. Alright, so a bit of graphite powder. I'll move this ring backwards and forwards to work that in. And you can actually feel a change in the action as you work that in. Now I've got to blow all that powder away, so I'll go and do that. That seems fine. I'll just wipe that surface. Pick up any excess graphite powder that might have been lying around. That appears to be good. I'll move this blade actuating ring into the blade's open position, and I can start putting my shutter blades back in place. Is that camera focusing or not? I think it's doing alright. I haven't got my shutter blades cleaned yet. I'll have to clean them. Right, the shutter blades. These are quite marked, much more marked than the diaphragm blades were. They will have to be cleaned with a bit of naphtha. So I'm just cleaning them now. And hopefully the marks are just oil and that they'll clean away nicely. Just holding that to the light, checking the surface of that blade. That looks quite good. You could ignore a lot of the blackness that's coming off here because it's just pigment coming off my paper. That's good. That blade's cleaned up very well. There are no obvious marks there. I'll just pop that blade to one side on a piece of paper and go on to the next one. Now this one, that's the one that's had a bit of something stuck to the back of it. You can see it was a big blob of graphite grease by the looks of it, stuck on the tail of that blade. There's some slight staining to that blade, but nothing dramatic. Yeah, certainly something coming off there. The blades don't need to be perfect by any means, but you should get them as good as you can. And what happens with the oil on the shutter blades is much like diaphragm blades, is that the oil just glues the blades together. So typically they do not want to open. And sometimes they do not want to close, but usually do not want to open is the noticeable problem and the major fault. And that might show up as blank frames on your film. The shutter might work. 9 times out of 10, it's usually most pronounced first exposure of the day, and it's most pronounced when the weather's cold. Once the shutter fires once, it'll often act entirely normally until such time as the oils have had time to do their worst again. I've got the window light coming in from beside me on my right, so I can use that to judge from the reflection how clean I've got the blades. Those blades are fine now. I can assemble the shutter. So, with my blade actuating ring ready, with the blade actuating ring round at the blade's open position, I can now put my shutter blades in place. First I've got to make sure that my tweezers are nice and clean and haven't got any oily residue on them. And start stacking the blades. The blades are all identical, and we start right here. That's the posty hole where the main drive, which the pinion runs through there. And unlike the diaphragm blades where all the blades are interleaved, on the shutter blades the blades lie one on top of the next. So there is a first blade and a last blade. There's our last blade going in. All the blades are present and correct. All I've got to do is make sure that they're sitting down over their pivots correctly. We can take the shutter case, and this only goes on in one direction. Lower that over the top. Line it up with the screw holes. And there are 3 screws that hold that in place. Now I do the screws up very lightly to start with, because if a shutter blade has become displaced when you're lifting the case over it, you do not want to trap the shutter blade between one of the pivot pins and the case as you do the screws up. Otherwise you'd end up damaging the blade. Well, there you go, the blades move freely, so everything's correctly in place, and I can do my 3 screws up. So there's our shutter blades, open and close smoothly, no stickiness there. Here's our diaphragm blades at the back, they open and close smoothly. Now I can start reassembling the components on the mechanism plate. Of course I'll have to clean a few things as I go.